Welcome to Boring Historian, gentle listener, to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we travel not to bustling cities or gleaming palaces, but to the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient Dacia land that once stretched across what we now call Romania and beyond. Close your eyes, if you will, and let your mind drift backward through the centuries, past the familiar comforts of your modern world, past the noise and light of our age. We re-traveling to a time when the highland air was sharp with the scent of pine and woods, when the rhythm of daily life was dictated not by clocks, but by the sun's arc across stone peaks and the turning of seasons marked in frost and flame. The Dacian and ultimately doomed built their fortresses high in the Carpathian mountains, perched like eagles' nests on rocky outcrops that seemed to touch the very clouds. These were not mere military installations, but entire communities carved from living stone, where families lived, worked, and prepared for wars that would ultimately reshape their world forever. Tonight, you'll walk among them. You'll feel the bite of mountain wind against your face, taste the smoke of their fires, and hear the distant clash of Roman steel against Dacian bronze. But do not worry, you are safe here in your warm bed, a mere observer to these ancient struggles. Let the weight of centuries settle around you like a familiar blanket as we begin our descent into their world. Imagine yourself awakening not to the gentle hum of heating systems or the soft glow of electric light, but to absolute darkness broken only by the dying embers of last night's fire. The air around you is so cold it seems to bite at your lungs with each breath. And somewhere in the distance, you can hear the low moan of wind threading through stone passages carved directly into the mountainside. You are in Sarmizegetis, Regia, the sacred capital of the Dacian kingdom, though you might not recognize it as a city at all. No streets wind between buildings. Here you find yourself in a complex of terraced stone platforms, each level carved and fitted with blocks so perfectly matched that no mortar holds them together. The fortress clings to the mountainside like something that grew from the rock itself, its walls following the natural contours of cliff and crag. The bed beneath you is not a bed at all, but a raised platform of stone covered with layers of wool, felt, and fur. The wool still carries the lanolin scent of the sheep it came from, mixed with the smoke that permeates everything in this place. Above you, timber beams support a roof of slate and thatch, but the cold seems to seep through every gap, every joint, reminding you constantly that you are sheltered only by the thinnest margin from the vast, indifferent wilderness beyond these walls. As consciousness fully returns, you become aware of sounds that would be utterly foreign to modern ears. There is no gentle whisper of forced air through vents, no distant hum of traffic or machinery. Instead, you hear the sharp crack of expanding wood as the temperature drops, the skitter of small stones loosened by frost and falling down the mountainside. And beneath it all, a sound that makes your blood chill the long, haunting howl of wolves echoing between the peaks. But there are human sounds, too, reassuring in their familiarity across the centuries. Someone is already awake, moving carefully through the pre-dawn darkness, and you hear the soft scrape of metal against stone as they work to coax life back into the banked coals of the central hearth. The first wisps of smoke begin to curl upward, carrying with them the resinous scent of pine and the sharper temps of burning birch bark. You pull the heavy fur covering more tightly around yourself, but the cold has already begun its work. Your breath forms small clouds in the dim light, and you can feel the chill creeping up from the stone floor through whatever layers of felt and hide separate you from it. In a modern home, you might simply adjust the thermostat and return to sleep. Here, survival demands movement, demands the constant tending of fire, and the careful rationing of fuel that must last through winters that can stretch for 6 long months. The person tending the fire, perhaps, the head of this household, perhaps a servant or slave captured in one of the endless border raids, moves with practiced efficiency born of necessity. Every motion is deliberate, economical. Wood is precious here, above the tree line where only the hardiest pines can find purchase in the rocky soil. Each piece must be earned through dangerous expeditions down the mountainside. Each log carried back up treacherous paths that might be blocked by snow for months at a time. Boiling roots and wearing wool, Dacian, food and clothing, as the fire begins to catch and the first real warmth starts to push back against the darkness. You notice the gradual awakening of the household around you. Children stir beneath their own coverings of wool and fur, their breath forming small clouds as they whisper to each other in the ancient Dacian Tunga language that will die with them, leaving behind only fragments carved in stone and the echoes preserved in modern Romanian. The woman of the house forward is likely a woman, as Dacian society granted women rights and roles that would seem startling even by modern standards. Begins the day's first meal, but do not expect anything resembling the abundance you might find in your own kitchen. Here, every calorie must be earned, every grain of barley hoarded against the possibility of siege or failed harvest. She moves to large ceramic jars sunk into the stone floor, vessels that serve as both storage and protection against the cold. From these, she draws handfuls of grain barley mostly, with perhaps some wheat traded from the warmer valleys below. But grain alone will not sustain life through a Dacian winter. She adds wild roots gathered during the brief mountain summer, bulbs of wild onion, the starchy tubers of mountain plants whose names have been lost to time, bitter herbs that provide vitamins the body craves. The cooking vessel itself is a marvel of practical engineering, a large bronze cauldron suspended over the fire by iron chains. Bronze was precious to the Dacians, though not as precious as iron, which they considered almost magical in its properties. The cauldron has been passed down through generations, its surface dark with the patina of countless meals, countless mornings, just like this one. As the water begins to warm painfully slowly, by modern standards you notice the clothing being distributed among the family members. Dacian dress was dictated entirely by the demands of survival in this harsh climate. No consideration was given to fashion or appearance beyond the practical requirements of staying alive. The basic garment for both men and women was a long tunic of heavy wool, dyed with natural pigments that gave it deep, muted colors, browns and grays, and the dark blue that could be coaxed from mountain berries. Over this went a cloak, also of wool, but woven so tightly that it could shed light rain and snow. The wealthy might have cloaks lined with fur bear, wolf, or the prized pelts of the great lynx that stalked the highest peaks. But it is a footwear that would truly test a modern person's endurance. Dacian boots were marvels of engineering, necessity layers of felt and leather, wrapped and bound around the foot and lower leg, designed to keep out moisture and cold but requiring constant attention and repair. The leather came from cattle and sheep, but also from the hides of deer and wild boar hunted in the forests below. Each boot was essentially handmade, fitted to its owner's foot, and represented hours of skilled labor that made them nearly as valuable as weapons. The sound of spears in the wind as the morning progresses and the pale sun begins to cast long shadows through the fortress. You become aware of sounds that speak to the constant state of military readiness that defined Dacian life. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the rhythmic clatter of practice weapons, wooden spears and shields used for training, their impacts echoing off the stone walls with a hollow, repetitive sound that becomes almost hypnotic. The Dacian military was built around the reality of their situation. A relatively small population spread across difficult terrain, facing the constant threat of both barbarian raids and Roman expansion. Every adult male was expected to fight when needed, and many of the women as well. The distinction between soldier and civilian was largely meaningless in a society where survival depended on the ability of every person to defend their home. Their primary weapon was the folks, a curved blade mounted on a long handle that could be used either as a polearm or swung like a massive sword. The folks was uniquely Dacian, and Roman accounts speak of it with a mixture of respect and horror. The weapon's curved blade could hook around Roman shields and armor, finding gaps that straight swords could not reach. Roman soldiers eventually developed reinforced helmets and arm guards, specifically to counter the folks, testament to its effectiveness in Dacian hands. But weapons require constant maintenance in this environment. The mountain air, while clean, carries enough moisture to rust iron overnight if left unprotected. You can hear the soft whisper of whetstones against metal as warriors maintain their blades, a sound that must continue daily, lest their weapons fail them in the moment of greatest need. The spear points and sword blades represent not just military might, but economic power. Iron was the foundation of Dacian wealth, mined from deposits in the surrounding mountains and worked by smiths whose skills were considered almost supernatural. A Dacian blacksmith held a position in society similar to that of a priest, for he could transform raw ore into the tools and weapons that made life possible in this harsh environment. Dreams of Rome and warnings from the forest as the day advances and the fortress comes fully to life around you. You begin to understand the psychological weight that is pressed down upon every day. From the highest noble to the humblest farmer, to the south and east, beyond the mountain path, lay the expanding Roman Empire, a military and administrative machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Romans were not just another tribe to be raided or negotiated with. They represented a completely different way of organizing human society, one based on written law, professional armies, and the systematic exploitation of conquered territories. Dacian scouts brought back reports that must have seemed like fever dreams to mountain dwellers. Cities with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, roads that stretched for thousands of miles, aqueducts that brought fresh water from distant mountains. But these marvels came at a cost that the Dacians could clearly see. Roman expansion was not just conquest, it was transformation. Tribes that submitted to Roman rule found their children speaking Latin, their traditional ways abandoned for Roman customs. Their young men marched off to fight Rome's wars in distant lands they would never see again. In the evening, as families gathered around their fires for the day's final meal, you might hear the older members speaking in hushed tones about omens and portents. The Dacians were deeply spiritual people, and their religion was intimately connected to the natural world around them. Every unusual bird flight, every strange coloration in the sunset, every deviation from the normal patterns of wind and weather was examined for signs of divine favor or warning. Their priests, who served also as judges and military advisors, read meaning in the entrails of sacrificed animals, the patterns of smoke rising from sacred fires, the movements of celestial bodies across the night sky. The messages they found there were increasingly ominous. The old order was ending, they declared. The gods themselves seemed to be withdrawing from the world, leaving humanity to face its trials alone. And perhaps they were right. Archaeological evidence suggests that the generation living in Sarmizegetus Regia during the early years of the 2nd century CE was indeed witnessing the end of their world. Within decades, Roman legions would march through these same mountain paths. Roman engineers would survey these same peaks for roads and fortifications. And Roman administrators would divide this ancient land into provinces and taxation districts. But tonight, in the flickering light of pine-fed fires, surrounded by the familiar weight of stone and the comforting presence of family, that future remains mercifully hidden. The only reality is the warmth of the hearth, the taste of barley porridge flavored with wild herbs, and the ancient rhythm of mountain life that has continued unchanged for countless generations. Outside, the wind continues its eternal conversation with the peaks, carrying scents of snow and pine and the distant promise of spring. Wolves call to each other across the valleys, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that speak of wilderness still untamed. And high above, stars wheel across a sky so clear and dark that it seems you could reach up and pluck them like berries from an infinite tree. This is the world you would wake to as a Dacian harsh, beautiful, precarious, and free. It demanded everything from those who chose to live within it, offering in return only the hard-won satisfaction of survival, and the knowledge that they had remained true to their ancestors' ways, even as the world changed around them. Sleep well, knowing that your own warm bed represents a luxury that those mountain dwellers could scarcely imagine, yet understanding too that they possessed something we have perhaps lost, an unshakable connection to the land that sustained them, and the certainty that every day of life was a victory wrested from an unforgiving world. Decebalus, the last king of the Dacians, in the gentle transition from one story to another. Let us turn our attention from the daily struggles of ordinary Dacians to the man who would define their final chapter, a king, whose very name has echoed through history like the last note of a song played in an empty hall. Decebalus, whose name meant brave as 10 men, was not born to rule. He was not the son of kings, nor did he inherit it, thrown through the comfortable mechanisms of dynastic succession that we might expect from ancient royalty. Instead, he emerged from the warrior class during a time of crisis, sometime in the latter decades of the 1st century CE, when the Dacian kingdom found itself caught between the expanding Roman Empire to the south and the restless barbarian tribes pressing down from the northern steppes. The traditional kings had proven inadequate to these challenges, their responses either too timid to inspire confidence or too reckless to ensure survival. Decebalus possessed that rare combination of military genius and political acumen that appears perhaps once in a generation. Contemporary Roman sources, though written by his enemies, speak of him with grudging respect. He was tall, for his time, 5.5 feet in height, with the characteristic long hair and beard that marked Dacian nobility. But it was not his physical presence that commanded loyalty. It was his ability to see beyond the immediate crisis to the larger patterns of history unfolding around his people. He understood, as few of his contemporaries did, that the Romans were not merely another enemy to be fought with traditional methods. They represented a new kind of threat, systematic, patient, and ultimately irresistible, unless met with equally systematic resistance. Where previous Dacian leaders had relied on the natural strength of their mountain fortress and the fierce courage of their warriors, Decebalus began to transform Dacian society itself into a weapon of resistance. The Roman wars began. The first conflicts between Decebalus and Rome began not with grand declarations of war, but with the kind of border skirmishes that had been common for generations. Dacian raiding parties would descend from their mountain strongholds to strike at Roman settlements across the Danube, carrying off cattle, grain, and captives, before melting back into the highlands like morning mist. But under Decebalus, these raids took on a different character. They became more coordinated, more strategic in their timing and targets. Roman garrisons found themselves facing attacks that seemed to anticipate their movements, that struck at their weakest points with uncanny precision. Supply trains vanished in mountain passes. Isolated forts woke to find their walls scaled in the pre-dawn darkness, their defenders overwhelmed before they could sound an alarm. The Roman response was predictable and methodical. Emperor Domitian, ruling from the comfortable distance of Rome, dispatched additional legions to the Danubian frontier under the command of experienced generals who had proven themselves in campaigns against German tribes and British. They established fortified camps, constructed roads to speed the movement of troops and supplies, and began the systematic process of turning the frontier into an impermeable barrier. But Decebalus had anticipated this as well. While Roman engineers built their roads and fortifications, Dacian smiths worked day and night in hidden forges, producing weapons and armor for an army that was growing beyond anything the Romans had imagined possible. Decebalus had done something that no previous Dacian leader had managed. He had united not just his own people, but neighboring tribes who had previously been enemies or indifferent allies. The Sarmatians, those horse-mounted warriors of the eastern steppes, found themselves fighting alongside Dacian infantry. Germanic tribes that had fled Roman expansion in the west discovered common cause with mountain dwellers they had never met. It was a confederation held together not by treaties or marriage alliances, but by the shared recognition that Roman expansion represented an existential threat to all traditional ways of life. The battle for Sarmizegetus, the decisive confrontation, came in the spring of 87 CE, though the battle was not fought at Sarmizegetus itself, but in the valleys below, where Roman formations could deploy their disciplined tactics, and Dacian forces could use their knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. The engagement began at dawn, as Roman trumpets echoed off the mountainsides, and the steady tramp of marching feet announced the approach of several legions. Decebalus had chosen his ground carefully. The valley was narrow enough to prevent the Romans from using their superior numbers effectively, but wide enough to allow for the complex tactical maneuvers that Dacian warfare demanded. Ancient streams had carved the landscape into a series of ridges and hollows that could conceal entire units of warriors until the moment of attack. The Roman general sources differ on his identity, though it was likely Cornelius Fuscus had confidence in his professional soldiers and their proven methods. Roman legions had conquered Gaul and Britain, had crushed the revolt of Spartacus, and pacified the tribes of Spain. The systematic application of Roman military engineering seemed capable of solving any tactical problem that barbarian ingenuity could devise. But as the morning mist began to burn away under the strengthening sun, the Romans discovered that they were facing something entirely new. The Dacian forces were not arranged in the loose tribal formations that Roman commanders expected from barbarian armies. Instead, they moved with discipline that matched Roman training. Supported by weapons and armor that rivaled Roman equipment in quality, the battle itself unfolded with a terrible, almost choreographed precision. Roman formations advanced in their traditional manipular system, shields locked together, spears projecting in disciplined arrays. But as they crested each ridge, they found themselves facing not the desperate charges of undisciplined tribesmen, but coordinated attacks by warriors who understood Roman tactics well enough to counter them. The Folks proved its worth that day. Roman shields, designed to stop straight thrusts and slashing cuts, were inadequate against the curved blades that could hook around their edges and find the gaps in armor beneath. Roman casualties began to mount at a rate that shocked veteran centurions, who had survived dozens of campaigns. Rome's final push, the defeat of Roman forces in Dacia, sent shockwaves through the empire that reached even the marble halls of the Palatine Hill. Already struggling with challenges on multiple frontiers, found himself facing something that Roman pride could not accept. A barbarian kingdom that had proven capable of meeting Roman legions on equal terms and emerging victorious. The emperor's response was to commit resources to the Dacian problem on a scale that dwarfed previous campaigns. New legions were raised and equipped specifically for mountain warfare. Engineers began designing siege equipment capable of dealing with fortifications carved directly from living rock. Perhaps most importantly, Roman intelligence networks began the patient work of mapping Dacian society, identifying potential weaknesses that could be exploited. But Decebalus was not idle during this period. He understood that his initial victory had bought him time, not permanent security. The wealth of Dacian gold mines was systematically converted into weapons and fortifications. Diplomatic missions were sent to every tribe and kingdom that had reason to fear Roman expansion, seeking allies and coordinating resistance efforts across hundreds of miles of frontier. The Dacian king also began what might be recognized today as a systematic program of technological development. Dacian smiths studied captured Roman weapons and armor, adapting useful innovations while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that gave their own equipment advantages in mountain warfare. Dacian engineers examined Roman siege techniques and began developing countermeasures hidden passages that would allow defenders to strike at besieging forces from unexpected directions, water systems that could not be easily cut off, storage facilities that could sustain a fortress through extended siege. When the renewed Roman offensive finally came, under Emperor Trajan in 101 CE, it represented the largest military commitment that Rome had made to any single campaign since the conquest of Gaul. 5 full legions, supported by auxiliary units, drawn from across the empire, crossed the Danube on pontoon bridges that stretched 4 miles across the swift-flowing river. Trajan himself took personal command of the campaign, recognizing that failure in Dacia would undermine his authority throughout the empire. This was no longer simply a matter of frontier security, it had become a test of Roman military supremacy itself. The suicide of a king. The final siege of Sarmisagetus Regia began in the summer of 106 CE. After 5 years of campaigning that had gradually worn down Dacian resistance through a combination of military pressure and systematic devastation of the agricultural regions that supported the mountain fortresses, Roman engineers had learned to fight in terrain they had never encountered before. While Dacian warriors had discovered that courage and tactical skill could not indefinitely overcome numerical superiority and limitless resources, the siege itself was a masterwork of Roman military engineering. Unable to assault the fortress directly because of its position high on an almost vertical mountainside, Roman forces surrounded the peak and began the methodical process of cutting off all supply routes. Auxiliary units composed of Germanic and Gallic warriors, who understood mountain warfare better than traditional Roman legionaries, established a ring of outposts that made it impossible for Dacian forces to break out or for supplies to reach the defenders. But the Romans also employed psychological warfare with characteristic efficiency. Captured Dacian warriors were executed within sight of the fortress walls. Surrounding villages were burned methodically, their inhabitants enslaved or killed. The message was clear: submission might bring mercy, but continued resistance would result in the complete extermination of Dacian civilization. For Decebalus, watching from the walls of his ancient capital, the choice must have been agonizing beyond modern comprehension. He could surrender and perhaps preserve the lives of his people, but only at the cost of everything that made them die. Roman peace meant Roman law, Roman customs, Roman gods. It meant the end of a culture that had existed in these mountains for over 1,000 years. The king's final days were spent in consultation with his priests and advisors, seeking guidance from gods who seemed to have withdrawn their favor from their chosen people. Archaeological evidence suggests that the final weeks of the siege were marked by desperate religious ceremonies, sacrifices offered on altars that had served the Dacian people since time immemorial. Divination rituals intended to find some path forward that did not lead to either slavery or annihilation. When the end came, it came suddenly. Roman forces had succeeded in locating and cutting off the hidden springs that supplied the fortress with water. Faced with the choice between slow death by thirst and surrender, Decebalus made the decision that would define his legacy for all subsequent generations. Rather than face capture and the inevitable humiliation of being paraded through Roman chains, the last king of the Dacians chose death on his own terms. Ancient sources describe his final moments with the kind of detail that suggests Roman respect for an enemy who had proven worthy of their steel. Decebalus gathered his remaining nobles around him in the great hall of the fortress, spoke words that have not been preserved but that contemporary observers described as worthy of a king, and then fell upon his sword in the ancient manner. His death marked not just the end of a reign, but the end of an entire way of life. Within months, Roman colonists would begin arriving in the conquered territory. Latin would replace the Dacian language in official documents and public discourse. The great fortress of Sarmizegetus Regia would be abandoned, its stones eventually carried away to build Roman towns in the valleys below. Yet something of Decebalus survived even this comprehensive defeat. His name became a rallying cry for subsequent generations of rebels and resistance fighters. Roman historians, despite writing for audiences that expected barbarian enemies to be portrayed as savage and found themselves describing him in terms usually reserved for Roman heroes. He had fought Rome to a standstill for nearly 2 decades, had inflicted defeats on legions that had never known defeat, and had died in a manner that even his enemies recognized as noble. In the quiet moments before sleep, imagine the last conversations in that mountain fortress. The final words spoken in a language that would soon be forgotten. The last prayers offered to gods whose names would survive only in fragmentary inscriptions. The weight of endings settles around us like mountain mist, reminding us that all human endeavors, no matter how brave or noble, must eventually yield to the passage of time. The mountain sanctuaries of the Dacians, let your mind drift now from the clash of armies and the fall of kings to quieter mysteries. 2 questions that have puzzled archaeologists and historians for more than a century. High in the Carpathian Mountains, scattered across peaks that few modern visitors ever see, lie the remains of structures that challenge our understanding of what ancient peoples could accomplish with stone and faith and an almost supernatural understanding of astronomical precision. These are the sacred sites of the Dacian circular sanctuaries built from massive limestone blocks, arranged in patterns that speak the knowledge of mathematics and astronomy that rivals anything achieved by their more famous contemporaries in Rome or Greece. Yet they were constructed by a people who left no written records of their methods, no technical manuals describing their engineering principles, no architectural treatises explaining the symbolic meaning embedded in every carefully placed stone. The most famous of these sanctuaries lies near Sarmizegetus Regia itself, though it predates the fortress by several centuries. Archaeologists call it simply the Circular Sanctuary, a name that captures neither its grandeur nor its mystery. Picture, if you can, a perfect circle nearly 100 feet in diameter, constructed from limestone blocks so precisely cut and fitted that even today, after 2 millennia of mountain weather, the joints between them remain almost invisible. But this is not merely a circle of stones arranged by ancient hands. For purposes we can only guess at, the blocks themselves are massive, weighing several tons. They were shaped with tools that could achieve tolerances measured in fractions of inches. Modern stonemasons working with power tools and laser levels struggled to match the precision that Dacian craftsmen achieved with bronze chisels and careful observation of natural forms. The sanctuary consists of multiple concentric circles, each serving a different function in the complex religious ceremonies that once took place here. The outer ring was constructed from the largest blocks, creating a barrier that separated the sacred space from the mundane world beyond. Within this, smaller circles mark positions that correspond precisely to the rising and setting points of various celestial bodies, not just the sun and moon, but specific stars and planetary conjunctions that held religious significance for the Dacian people. Archaeological investigation has revealed that the floor of the sanctuary was paved with smaller stones arranged in intricate geometric patterns. Some of these patterns appear to be purely decorative, but others clearly serve functional purposes related to the ceremonies conducted here. Channels carved into the stone pavement directed the flow of water during purification rituals, while shallow depressions marked the positions where participants would stand during different phases of the religious calendar. The spiral columns of Trajan, what wasn't carved, the mystery of Dacian religious practices becomes even more intriguing when we consider what the Romans chose not to record about their conquered enemies. Trajan's column in Rome, that magnificent spiral of marble that commemorates the Dacian Wars, presents a detailed visual narrative of the campaigns Roman legions crossing rivers, besieging fortresses, accepting the submission of barbarian chiefs. Yet careful examination of these relief carvings reveals significant gaps, deliberate omissions that speak to aspects of Dacian culture that the Romans found either incomprehensible or too disturbing to preserve in public art. The carvings show Dacian warriors in battle, Dacian nobles in council, Dacian civilians fleeing before Roman advances, but they do not show the religious ceremonies that ancient sources tell us were central to Dacian resistance. Roman writers describe rituals conducted in mountain sanctuaries, ceremonies involving human sacrifice and divine consultation that strengthen Dacian resolve even in the face of overwhelming odds. These omissions become more significant when we realize that Roman artistic conventions typically depicted conquered peoples with careful attention to their exotic customs and strange religious practices. Roman audiences enjoyed seeing the barbarous rituals of their enemies, viewing such depictions as confirmation of Roman civilization's. The fact that Dacian religious practices are largely absent from Trajan-esque column suggests that they were somehow different, perhaps more sophisticated or more disturbing than the Romans were prepared to acknowledge. Contemporary written sources provide tantalizing hints about what these censored ceremonies might have involved. Dacian priests, known as apparently possessed knowledge of astronomy and mathematics that impressed even Roman observers. They calculated eclipses with precision that rivaled the best Roman astronomers, predicted seasonal changes with accuracy that allowed Dacian farmers to maximize their harvest yields, and maintained calendars that tracked celestial cycles over periods of decades. But the Tarabosts were more than mere astronomers and mathematicians. They served as judges in legal disputes, advisors to kings and military commanders, and intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. Their training apparently involved years of study in mountain sanctuaries, learning traditions that had been preserved orally for countless generations. The Romans, practical in their approach to conquered territories, typically co-opted useful local knowledge while suppressing practices they found threatening. The absence of any record of Roman attempts to preserve Dacian astronomical knowledge suggests that it was somehow incompatible with Roman religious and philosophical frameworks to be safely incorporated into the Roman system of understanding the world. The gold hoards that vanished, perhaps no mystery of ancient Dacia has captured the imagination, quite like the question of what happened to the legendary gold hoards that supposedly financed Dacian resistance and then vanished without trace during the final Roman conquest. Ancient sources speak repeatedly of Dacian wealth derived from gold mines in the surrounding mountains, wealth that allowed Decebalus to maintain armies, construct fortifications, and purchase alliances with neighboring tribes. The scale of this wealth, if contemporary accounts are to be believed, was staggering even by Roman standards. Pliny, the Elder, writing during the reign of Vespasian, claimed that Dacian gold mines produced more precious metal in a single year than the famous mines of Spain had yielded in a decade. Dio Cassius, describing Trajan's triumph after the Dacian conquest, reported that the Romans captured enough gold to finance public works projects for an entire generation. Yet archaeological investigation of known Dacia sites has yielded surprisingly little evidence of this legendary wealth. A few gold artifacts have been discovered: ornamental torques worn by nobles, decorative fittings for weapons and ceremonial objects, coins that appear to have been minted specifically for trade with neighboring peoples. But nothing approaching the vast hoards described by ancient historians has ever been found. The most intriguing theory about the missing gold suggests that it was systematically hidden during the final years of the wars, buried in locations known only to the highest-ranking priests and nobles. Dacian society, with its strong oral traditions and sophisticated understanding of astronomy, would have been capable of maintaining precise records of hiding places without committing such information to writing that might fall into Roman hands. Some modern researchers have pointed to unusual geological formations in the Carpathian Mountains, carefully arranged stones that serve no obvious structural purpose, alignments that correspond to astronomical phenomena, marker systems that might encode information about locations significant to ancient peoples. These formations are scattered across hundreds of square miles of mountain terrain, often in places so remote that they have been visited by perhaps a dozen modern explorers in the past century. If the gold hoards do exist, they represent more than mere treasure in the conventional sense. They would constitute a time capsule of Dacian civilization, containing not just precious metals but artifacts that could revolutionize our understanding of ancient European culture. Religious objects, astronomical instruments, examples of Dacian craftsmanship and materials that have not survived. In other contexts, all of this might lie waiting in hidden chambers carved from living rock and sealed with the kind of precision that characterized all Dacian stonework. Dacian wolves, stars, and shaman kings, the religious worldview that shaped Dacian civilization, remains one of the most enigmatic aspects of their culture, preserved only in fragmentary references and the symbolic decorations found on surviving artifacts. Central to their belief system was a complex relationship with the natural world that went far beyond the simple animism often attributed to barbarian peoples by classical sources. The wolf held particular significance in Dacian mythology, though not as a symbol of savagery or predatory violence. Instead, wolves appear to have represented wisdom, loyalty to the pack, and the ability to survive in harsh environments through cooperation and intelligence. Dacian military standards featured wolf heads, carved from silver and bronze, and warriors apparently wore wolf pelts, not just for warmth, but as spiritual protection. Archaeological evidence suggests that wolves were never hunted casually by the Dacians. Wolf bones found at settlement sites show evidence of careful butchering and preservation techniques that speak to ceremonial rather than purely practical use. Some scholars have theorized that certain Dacian rituals involve the consumption of wolf meat under specific astronomical conditions, perhaps as part of initiation ceremonies for young warriors or religious observances linked to seasonal cycles. The relationship between Dacian rulers and their priests presents another puzzle that has no clear parallel in other ancient cultures. Unlike the sharp distinction between temporal and religious authority found in most ancient societies, Dacian kings appear to have served simultaneously as military leaders, judicial authorities, and high priests. This combination of roles required not just political and military skill, but mastery of the astronomical and mathematical knowledge that underpinned Dacian religious practice. The training required to fulfill these complex responsibilities must have been extraordinary. Kings needed to understand the movement of celestial bodies well enough to determine auspicious times for military campaigns, legal proceedings, and religious ceremonies. They had to memorize vast amounts of oral genealogies, religious formulas, and astronomical calculations that had been passed down through countless generations without the aid of written records. Perhaps most remarkably, they had to maintain this knowledge while simultaneously dealing with the practical demands of governing a society under constant military pressure. The image that emerges from fragmentary sources is of rulers who spent their mornings consulting star charts and their afternoons planning military campaigns, who could calculate eclipses with mathematical precision, and then lead cavalry charges against Roman formations. This integration of intellectual and practical skills may explain why Dacian resistance proved so effective for so long. Their leaders were not simply brave warriors or charismatic politicians, but individuals who understood their world with a depth and precision that allowed them to make decisions based on both immediate tactical considerations and long-term strategic patterns that their enemies could not perceive. The astronomical knowledge possessed by Dacian priests and kings appears to have been remarkably sophisticated. Stone circles found at various Dacian sites show alignments that track not just obvious celestial phenomena but more subtle cycles involving the precession of equinoxes and the complex orbital patterns of planets. This level of astronomical understanding required centuries of careful observation and mathematical analysis, suggesting that Dacian intellectual traditions were far older and more developed than Roman sources generally acknowledged. Modern archaeoastronomy has revealed that some Dacian stone circles could predict eclipses with accuracy comparable to the best astronomical tables produced by Hellenistic Greek mathematicians. They tracked the 18.6-year cycle of lunar standstills, the varying declination of planetary orbits, and other phenomena that require not just careful observation but sophisticated mathematical models to predict accurately. The religious ceremonies conducted at these astronomical sites remain largely mysterious. Those surviving artifacts provide tantalizing clues. Bronze plaques decorated with intricate spiral patterns suggest rituals involving the symbolic representation of celestial movements. Silver cups engraved with star maps indicate that astronomical knowledge was incorporated into religious observances in ways that linked earthly activities to cosmic cycles. Perhaps most intriguing are the scattered references in Roman sources to Dacian prophecies, predictions about the future that proved accurate enough to impress even skeptical Roman observers. These prophecies may have been based not on supernatural revelation, but on sophisticated understanding of historical cycles, astronomical patterns, and the kind of long-term social analysis that becomes possible when a culture maintains detailed oral records over many generations. As you settle into deeper relaxation, imagine the priests of ancient Dacia standing in their stone circles under starfilled skies, tracking the slow dance of celestial bodies and finding in their movements the patterns that would guide their people through the challenges ahead. Picture them as both scientists and mystics, using mathematical precision to serve spiritual purposes, maintaining traditions that connected them to knowledge accumulated over centuries of careful observation. The silence of the mountains holds their secrets still, waiting perhaps for future archaeologists to uncover the hidden chambers where their most precious knowledge might have been preserved. Until then, we can only wonder at the sophistication of a culture that left no written records yet managed to encode profound wisdom in stone circles that continue to track the movements of stars with perfect accuracy after 2,000 years of wind and weather. Roman governors in Dacia, luxury on stolen stone. As our journey through ancient Dacia draws toward its gentle close, let us descend from the misty heights of mountain sanctuaries and forgotten gold hoards to witness the transformation that followed, a transformation so complete and systematic that it stands as one of history's most thorough examples of cultural replacement. Where once Dacian kings consulted star charts in stone circles, Roman governors now reclined on silk couches in marble halls, governing a province that bore little resemblance to the land that Decebalus had died defending. The first Roman governor of Dacia, appointed by Trajan himself in the immediate aftermath of conquest, was a man named Decimus Terentius Scornius, a career administrator, whose previous postings had included service in Egypt and Syria. His appointment reveals much about Roman intentions for their newest province. This was not to be a military frontier ruled by generals, but a fully integrated part of the empire administered by civilians trained in the arts of taxation, urban planning, and cultural assimilation. Scornius arrived in Dacia in 107 CE, less than a year after the suicide of to find a landscape that must have seemed almost impossibly wild to someone accustomed to the ordered prosperity of more established provinces. The great fortress of Sarmizegetus, Regia, still smoldered on its mountain peak, its stones blackened by the fires that had consumed the wooden structures within. The circular sanctuaries that had served as centers of Dacian religious life stood empty, their astronomical alignments still perfect, but their purpose forgotten by the Roman colonists, who would soon inhabit the valleys below. Yet Scornius and his successors faced a challenge that was both practical and psychological. They needed to establish Roman authority over a territory that was still largely wilderness, populated by survivors of a people who had proven themselves capable of inflicting devastating defeats on Roman legions. The solution they devised was characteristically Roman in its ambition and systematic in its execution. They would not merely occupy Dacia, but remake it entirely in Rome's image. The marble halls of Ulpia Traiana, the most visible symbol of this transformation, was the construction of Ulpia Traianus, a new city built in the valley below the ruined Dacian capital. The name itself announced Roman intentions. This was to be Trajan's city, named for the emperor who had conquered the province, but located where it could serve as an administrative center for the systematic exploitation of Dacian resources. The speed with which this city rose from empty valley floor astonished even Roman observers accustomed to their empire. Within 5 years of the conquest's conclusion, Ulpia Traiana boasted a forum larger than many provincial capitals, a theater capable of seating 10,000 spectators, public baths supplied by aqueducts that brought fresh water from mountain springs, and residential districts laid out according to the mathematical precision that characterized Roman urban planning everywhere from Britain to Mesopotamia. But it was in the governor's palace that the contrast between old and new Dacia became most stark. Where Dacian nobles had lived in stone halls heated by single central hearths, where they had slept on platforms covered with wool and fur, where they had eaten from bronze vessels and planned their resistance to Roman expansion. The Roman governor now inhabited a complex of buildings that rivaled anything to be found in Rome itself. The palace occupied an entire city block, its rooms arranged around multiple courtyards that provided light and air, while maintaining the privacy that Roman aristocrats considered essential to civilized life. The floors were covered with intricate mosaics imported from workshops in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean hunting scenes, mythological tableaux, geometric patterns that spoke of mathematical sophistication, far removed from the practical concerns of survival that had dominated Dacian artistic expression. The walls were decorated with frescoes painted by artists brought from the most fashionable studios in Rome and Alexandria. These depicted not the harsh realities of frontier life, but idealized landscapes of a Mediterranean world that existed primarily in the artistic imagination, pastoral scenes of shepherds and nymphs, architectural fantasies of impossible temples and gardens, mythological narratives that connected the governor's residence to the cultural traditions of classical antiquity. The transformation of daily life. Perhaps no aspect of the Roman transformation of Dacia was more thorough than the systematic replacement of indigenous patterns of daily life with practices imported wholesale from more established parts of the empire. The Roman colonists who began arriving within months of the conquest brought with them not just different customs and beliefs, but an entirely different understanding of what constituted civilized existence, where Dacian communities had organized themselves around the seasonal rhythms of mountain agriculture and the constant demands of military preparedness. Roman colonial life revolved around urban centers that served as nodes in the empire-wide network of trade, administration, and cultural exchange. The colonists were not pioneers in the American sense, individuals or families striking out on their own to establish homesteads in wilderness territory. Instead, they were participants in a planned settlement program designed to create instant reproductions of Roman urban life in conquered territories. The typical Roman colonist family arrived in Dacia with possessions that would have seemed impossibly luxurious to the mountain dwellers they were replacing. Their household goods included glass vessels manufactured in Syria, bronze cooking implements cast in Gallic workshops, ceramic tableware decorated with relief designs that told stories from Roman mythology. Their clothing was woven from fine wool and linen, imported from regions hundreds of miles away, dyed with colors that could only be produced using techniques and materials unavailable in the Carpathian Mountains. But it was not just material culture that marked the transformation. The Romans brought with them a completely different understanding of time itself, where Dacian life had been governed by natural cycles, the movements of sun and stars, the changing seasons, the life cycles of plants and animals. Roman existence operated according to artificial schedules that linked local activities to imperial administrative requirements. The Roman calendar, with its complex system of religious observances, market days, and legal schedules, replaced the astronomical calendar that had governed Dacian religious and social life. Roman law, codified in written statutes and administered by professional jurists, supplanted the oral traditions that had served as the foundation of Dacian justice for centuries. Even the hours of the day were measured differently, divided into 12 equal segments regardless of seasonal variations in daylight, rather than the flexible time reckoning that had allowed Dacian communities to adapt their activities to natural rhythms. The taste of empire, the dietary transformation that accompanied Roman colonization, provides a particularly intimate glimpse into the thoroughness of cultural replacement, where Dacian meals had consisted primarily of locally produced grains, vegetables, and meat, supplemented by wild plants gathered from mountain forests. Roman colonial tables featured delicacies imported from across the known world. The governor's kitchen in Elpia, Traiana, employed cooks trained in the sophisticated culinary traditions of the capital, capable of preparing meals that would not have seemed out of place at aristocratic dinner parties in Rome itself. These meals began with appetizers that might include oysters shipped alive from the Atlantic coast, olives preserved and brined from Greek islands, fresh fruits transported in specially designed containers from the sunny shores of North Africa. The main courses featured not just local game and domesticated animals, but exotic meats that demonstrated the governor's connection to trade networks spanning the entire empire. Peacocks from Asia Minor, wild boar from Germanic forests, fish preserved in salt from Mediterranean packing. Plant siege dish proclaimed the diner's participation in a civilization that could command resources from territories thousands of miles away. But perhaps most significantly, these meals were accompanied by wines that transformed the very act of dining into a cultural statement, where Dacians had consumed locally brewed beer and fermented beverages made from mountain plants. Roman tables featured wines from the most prestigious vineyards of Italy, Gaul, and Spain. These wines were not merely alcoholic beverages, but carriers of cultural meaning that connected colonial diners to the sophisticated social traditions of metropolitan Roman society. The preparation and consumption of these meals required not just expensive ingredients, but elaborate dining equipment that proclaimed the user's cultural sophistication. Roman dining rooms featured couches arranged around low tables, following customs that had evolved over centuries in Mediterranean climates. The tableware itself was a display of artistic refinement: silver, serving pieces decorated with mythological scenes, glass vessels blown in specialized workshops, ceramic plates and cups, that transformed the simple act of eating into an aesthetic experience. The gardens of memory perhaps nowhere was the contrast between Dacian and Roman approaches to life more visible than in the gardens that Roman colonists created around their homes and public buildings. These were not the practical herb gardens and vegetable plots that had served Dacian communities, but elaborate landscapes designed purely for aesthetic pleasure and the display of cultural refinement. The Governor's Palace featured terrace gardens that cascaded down the hillside and carefully planned arrangements of imported plants and architectural features. Roses from Damascus bloomed alongside laurels from Greece, their fragrances mingling with the scents of herbs brought from distant Mediterranean shores. Fountains supplied by the same aqueduct system that served the public baths created the sound of running water that reminded homesick colonists of the villa gardens they had known in Italy or Gaul. These gardens served purposes that went far beyond mere decoration. They were statements of cultural values, demonstrations that Roman civilization could transform even the harshest wilderness into spaces of beauty and contemplation, where Dacian communities had adapted themselves to the natural environment, learning to survive and even thrive within the constraints imposed by mountain climate and terrain. Roman colonists imposed their will upon the landscape, reshaping it to conform to aesthetic principles developed in entirely different geographical and climatic conditions. The maintenance of these gardens required not just enormous expenditures of time and resources, but the systematic importation of botanical knowledge and horticultural techniques that had evolved over centuries in more temperate regions. Roman gardeners in Dacia learned to protect delicate Mediterranean plants through Carpathian winters, to coax growth from soil that had never supported such species, to create microclimates that could sustain vegetation from dozens of different natural environments. Yet these gardens also represented something more subtle and perhaps more profound: the Roman ability to create beauty as a form of cultural conquest. Where military victory had destroyed Dacian political independence, aesthetic transformation completed the process of cultural replacement. The very landscape that had nurtured Dacian civilization for centuries was remade to reflect Roman sensibilities, Roman values, Roman dreams of what civilized existence should encompass. The silence of the mountains. As our journey through the world of ancient Dacia draws to its gentle conclusion, we return to the silence of the mountains that bracket this story, mountains that witnessed the rise and fall of a civilization, the clash of armies, and the systematic transformation of an entire way of life. Those peaks that once echoed with the sound of Dacian festivals and Roman siege engines now stand quiet under the same stars that guided Dacian priests in their astronomical calculations. The stone circles remain, their alignment still perfect after 2 millennia, though the knowledge needed to read their meanings died with the last generation that remembered the old ways. The mountain sanctuaries still crown their remote peaks, accessible now only to the most determined hikers and archaeologists. Their massive blocks still fitted together with precision that modern engineers struggle to match. In the valleys below, the ruins of Ulpia, Triana speak to the impermanence of even the most ambitious human projects. The marble halls where Roman governors once entertained, visiting dignitaries from the capital, have long since fallen to earthquake and time. The mosaics that once displayed mythological scenes now lie buried under centuries of accumulated soil. The aqueducts that brought fresh water from mountain springs were abandoned when later invasions made their maintenance impossible. Yet something endures beyond the physical remains of either culture. In the genetic heritage of modern Romanians, Dacian and Roman bloodlines intermingled to create a people who carry within themselves the legacy of both mountain fortress and marble palace. In the Romanian language, Latin roots support structures that linguists believe preserve elements of ancient Dacian grammar and vocabulary. In folk traditions that persist even today, echoes of both cultures survive in festivals, customs, and beliefs that connect modern people to ancestors who lived in worlds we can only imagine. The tragedy of the Dacians was not that they were weak or primitive, but that they encountered Roman expansion at a moment in history when resistance, no matter how skilled or brave, could not ultimately prevail against the systematic application of imperial resources. Their story reminds us that civilizations rise and fall not because of moral superiority or cultural destiny, but because of complex interactions between geography, technology, social organization, and the unpredictable currents of historical change. As you drift towards sleep, comforted by the warmth and security of your modern bed, perhaps you can spare a thought for those ancient peoples who struggled to preserve their ways of life against impossible odds, the Dacian farmers who tended their mountain fields under the constant threat of war, the Roman colonists who tried to recreate familiar comforts in an alien landscape, the governors who administered provinces far from home, the priests who maintained astronomical observations even as their world crumbled around them all. Of them faced the universal human challenge of finding meaning and purpose in the face of uncertainty and change. Their struggles are ended now, their fears resolved in the democracy of death that awaits all human endeavors. But their story continues to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us of the courage required to face an uncertain future, the dignity possible even in defeat, and the strange comfort that comes from knowing that we are part of a human story that extends far beyond our individual lives. Rest well, knowing that the mountains still stand guard over their secrets, that the stars still wheel in their ancient patterns across the darkness, and that somewhere in the silence between one breath and the next, the voices of the past whisper their eternal truths to those who have the patience to listen. Conclusion: the highland mists have settled now over our journey through ancient Dacia, wrapping the peaks and valleys in the same gentle shroud that has covered these mountains for countless centuries. We have walked among warriors and priests, governors and colonists, witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations as distant from us as stars, yet connected to our modern world by the unbroken chain of human experience. From the smoking hearths of Dacian hill fortresses to the marble halls of Roman governors, from the circular sanctuaries where priests tracked celestial movements to the terraced gardens where colonists tried to recreate distant homes, we have seen how human beings have always struggled to create meaning, beauty, and security in the face of an uncertain world. The Dacians built their lives around the rhythms of mountain and sky, creating a civilization that was both harsh and profound, both practical and spiritual. The Romans brought with them the accumulated wisdom and wealth of Mediterranean civilization, transforming wilderness into ordered provinces that spoke to human ambition and engineering skill. Both cultures faced the eternal challenge of mortality, the knowledge that all human achievements must eventually yield to time and change. Their stones remain, scattered across landscapes that few modern eyes will ever see. Their stories continue, whispered by wind through mountain passes, and preserved in the patient work of archaeologists and historians. Their legacy endures in the languages, customs, and genetic heritage of people who may never know the names of their ancient ancestors, but carry within themselves the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. As sleep approaches on quiet feet, carrying with it dreams of ancient worlds and distant stars, remember that you too are part of this continuing story, your own life, with its struggles and triumphs. Its moments of despair and wonder adds another chapter to the endless human tale of courage in the face of uncertainty, love in the presence of loss, and hope maintained despite all evidence that time eventually claims everything we hold dear. The mountains keep their watch, as they always have. The stars continue their ancient dance across the darkness, and somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, the voices of the past offer their gentle benediction to all who seek rest after the day's long journey. Sleep well. Welcome to Boring Historian. Take a deep breath and settle into your most comfortable position. Whether you're lying in bed, drifting off after a long day, or simply resting your eyes with the weight of history gently unfolding around you, you've found the right place. Tonight, we journey to ancient Rome, but not the bustling Senate halls or the marble-draped villas of the elite. No! This time we'll step into the world of the arena, into the worn sandals of those whose lives were lived not in luxury, but in training yards and dust-filled amphitheaters. The gladiators, much has been said about their battles. The roars of the crowd, the glint of metal, the risk of life and death. But beyond the arena spectacle, what was the rhythm of a gladiator's daily life? How did they wake, train, eat, and sleep? What routines, rituals, and quiet moments filled the long hours between their fights? Tonight, we'll move gently through their world. We'll begin by immersing ourselves in the day-to-day life of a Roman gladiator. From the moment they rose with the sun, to the final hours spent by the flicker of an oil lamp. Then, we'll drift into the story of one particular gladiator whose name, though weathered by time, still echoes in quiet corners of history. Next, we'll uncover the mysteries of their culture-rich training tools and archaeological remnants that offer clues to their humanity. And finally, we'll rise from the training barracks into the marble archways of elite Roman life, to understand how these warriors were both admired and unrespected, yet disposable. So let your breath slow and your thoughts quiet. Imagine yourself walking through the damp corridors of a Roman Dacia gladiator school. The air is thick with sweat, oil, and anticipation. Let us begin. Imagine the soft crackle of dawn outside a stone-walled dormitory. The air is cool and carries the earthy scent of olive trees and crushed dust beneath leather sandals. In the faint light, figures begin to stir shadows, shifting beneath woolen blankets laid on straw-stuffed pallets. The gladiators are waking. These are menans, sometimes even women living under strict regimens in a training school, often overseen by a lanista, a trainer and owner. Some were criminals, others were enslaved. A few even joined voluntarily, drawn by fame, food, or escape. The morning routine, the day begins early. The rhythm of a gladiator's life is tightly controlled. Before the sun fully rises, they wash their faces with cold water from a communal basin. There is no privacy, no space of one's own. Everything is shared. The floor is rough underfoot, worn smooth by hundreds of footsteps. A slave brings a simple meal bread dipped in vinegar, a fig perhaps, and a cup of watered wine. Meat is rare in the mornings. Breakfast is not a meal of indulgence, but of function. Then comes oiling the body, a crucial ritual. Gladiators coat their limbs with olive oil before training, both to protect their skin and to display their muscles, both for themselves and for the onlookers who sometimes gather to watch. Training grounds and discipline by the palestra, the training yard echoes with grunts and the dull thud of wooden weapons on straw dummies. Gladiators don't train with live blades, at least, not yet. Their weapons, rudis, scutum, and manica, are worn and heavy. Everything is designed to build strength, precision, and endurance. Imagine the rhythm of it. Step, swing, block, step again. The repetition is endless. They train in matched pairs, learning not just to fight but to perform. A real fight is a dance, slow enough for the audience to follow, dramatic enough to inspire cheers or gasps, and they are drilled hard. Discipline is constant. A disobedient gladiator might be whipped or denied food. A disrespectful one could face harsher punishments, meals, and rest at midday. They pause. The sun is high, and their bodies are coated in a mixture of oil, sweat, and dust. They scrape it off with a strigil, a curved metal tool, often passing it between them in silence. Lunch might be more generous: barley porridge, lentils, perhaps meat if they're lucky. Gladiators were known as hordery barleymen for their diet. Contrary to modern expectations, they ate little protein. They bulked up on grains and legumes. Fat provided a kind of armor against cuts in the arena. There is time for rest in the heat of the day. Some nap, others sit quietly, polishing their weapons or whispering in foreign tongues. In Eludici, many languages, Mingogrig, Thracian, Gallic, Punic, it is not always friendly. Afternoon sessions and bonding later, more drills. The afternoon brings sparring and mock duels. Sometimes, a seasoned doctor, a trainer, and often a former gladiator himself shouts commands from a shaded perch. The younger fighters are watched closely, their movements corrected, their footwork honed. A single mistake in the arena can mean death. But outside of training, bonds do form. There are friendships, rivalries, even whispered romances, letters smuggled out, messages scrawled on walls in charcoal and lime. They carve their names into door, practice lines in Latin, make quiet prayers to Fortuna or Mars. Evening quiet, and then the sun begins to fall. They eat again more bread, sometimes boiled cabbage or salted fish. The evening is quieter, the torches are lit. Some murmur to each other over dice games scratched into the floor. Others stare silently, lost in thought. The scent of oil lamps fills the dormitory. The clink of metal on stone gradually fades. One by one, they lie down again on stiff pallets, beneath heavy cloaks, and they wait for sleep. Some dream of freedom, others of victory. A few, perhaps, dream of home. The rhythm of their lives continues. Relentless, exhausting, yet strangely intimate. A world built on repetition, survival, and silence. And as the stars rise above ancient Rome, the gladiators rest, once more preparing for another day of controlled violence, quiet rituals, and the ever-present shadow of the arena. Imagine yourself walking through the corridors of a Roman villa, not one belonging to a gladiator, but to a man of power, a man who could change lives with a gesture. In this house, near polished marble fountains and mosaics of mythic beasts, a name is mentioned quietly over wine and oil lamps, a name spoken with curiosity, even admiration. To understand the strange and winding path of a gladiator's life, we now turn to him. A man who, against all odds, stepped out of the shadows of the ludus and into the favor of a Roman emperor. The unknown beginning. Very little is known of Spiculus's early life. He likely came from the provinces, perhaps Thrace or Germania, or maybe even from within Italy itself. His name, like many gladiators, may not have been his birth name. It could have been given to him by his lanista, or adopted as a marca persona. It was not uncommon for gladiators to take on stage names, just as actors did in the Roman theaters. Names that evoke danger, mystery, or a specific fighting style. Spiculus, sharp, quick, piercing. He was trained, as most were, in one of the elite schools of gladiation, perhaps the Ludus Magnaci, just beside the Great Colosseum, or another prominent facility under imperial oversight. There, he learned to fight, to fall, to bleed convincingly, and to survive Spiculus and Nero. But what set Spiculus apart was not just skill, it was proximity to power. Emperor Nero, infamous for his vanity, extravagance, and volatile moods, was a lover of the arena. He fancied himself an artist, an actor, even a charioteer, and he loved spectacle. Somewhere along the line, Spiculus caught his eye. Perhaps it was in a private match. Perhaps word of his victories in the arena reached the palace walls. We do not know the exact moment, but we do know that Nero saw something in him, and Nero rewarded what he liked. According to the ancient historian Suetonius, the emperor lavished gifts upon he was given houses, lands, and wealth, more than many free citizens ever possessed. He became, for a time, a celebrity not just among the plebeians who cheered in the stands, but among Rome's elite. Spiculus, the gladiator, lived like a senator. The arena victories, we can imagine him walking into the arena, his armor gleaming, not just another fighter, but a figure known by name. The crowd would erupt, perhaps chanting, throwing flowers, or cheering in chorus. He likely fought as a secutor, a heavily armored gladiator with a smooth helmet designed to duel against the nimble Riciarius, who wielded a net and trident. This secutor was methodical, deliberate. He did not dart or dance. He advanced. And Spiculus advanced well. His victories would have been celebrated with fanfare, perhaps even depicted on cups, oil lamps, or painted on the walls of taverns. Roman graffiti often honored famous fighters, and Spiculus may have seen his name etched beside crude sketches and boastful rhymes. The turning of the tide. But Rome, like all great powers, was unpredictable, fickle, As Nero's reign spiraled into decadence and paranoia, rebellions stirred. The Senate grew restless, and Nero, once adored, found himself increasingly isolated. In the final days of his rule, as enemies closed in, Nero sought to end his life. And here, we find one of the strangest moments in gladiator lore. It is said that, in those dark final hours, Nero wished for Spiculus not to fight alongside him, but to kill him. He wanted to die by Spiculus's hand. There was, perhaps, something symbolic in it. The emperor, undone by his own hubris, choosing death from the one man he had raised from the dust. A gladiator, a killer. But Spiculus was not there, or perhaps he refused. And so Nero died by another's help. A freedman, not a champion. Spiculus, for his part, vanishes from the historical record shortly after. Some believe he was executed during the purges that followed Nero's fall. Others say he escaped, retreating into anonymity with the wealth he had gained. No one knows for certain the echo of his story, but even in absence, Spiculus's story lingers. He was not just a fighter, he was an exception, a man who rose above his fate, who tasted the privileges of power, and who walked the strange, narrow line between spectacle and substance. And yet, despite all the wealth, the favors, the lands, he remained what he had always been in the eyes of Rome. Gladiators could be celebrated, worshipped, gifted, but they could never truly belong. And in that truth lies the quiet sorrow of Spiculus's story, a man chosen by an emperor, admired by the masses. Yet, when the empire trembled, utterly alone, as the light of Spiculus's tale fades, imagine now the ruins of a training yard, tools left leaning against a wall, the distant echo of a crowd that no longer exists. And from here, we'll drift into the quieter realm of culture and mystery, where archaeology whispers of what words could not record. Let us now leave behind the names and known deeds of the few, and instead turn our gaze to the countless unnamed, to the thousands of gladiators whose stories were never written down, but whose traces remain etched into stone, buried in sand, preserved in fragments of armor, graffiti, and ash. This is the realm of clues, of half-faded inscriptions and curious artifacts. A quiet archaeology of a violent profession. The training schools, silent walls, and dusty yards across the Roman world. From Capua to Pompeii, gladiator schools once buzzed with activity. Now, they lie in ruins, quiet, crumbling, with only the wind whispering through ancient doorways. Imagine wandering through one of these ruins. The sun is high, the stone walls still warm from centuries of exposure. Here is the central courtyard, where men once sparred. Over there, narrow cells line the walls, each just large enough for a single straw mat and a shelf. Some of these training schools were connected directly to amphitheaters, like the Ludus Magnus in Rome, linked to the Colosseum through a hidden tunnel. This allowed gladiators to appear in the arena, suddenly emerging from below, as if conjured by the gods. Archaeologists have found weights carved from stone, practiced swords made of wood, and thick metal helmets so heavy they would strain even the strongest neck. Each item a silent testament to the preparation behind every performance. The graffiti of Pompeii, voices from the wall. Pompeii, frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, gives us one of the clearest glimpses into how gladiators were perceived and how they saw themselves. Graffiti scrawled across tavern walls and alley corners often reads like modern fan mail. Simple phrases, preserved by ash. Salatus, the Thracian, 3 victories. The girl's heartthrob. Severus, a free birth. Fought 13 times, won 12. These weren't just fighters. They were adored. Gladiators were the celebrities of their age. Poets wrote verses about them. Wealthy women sent them secret notes. Children scratched their names into amphorae. And yet for all this fame, they were still enslaved. Still bound by contract, threat, and collar. In some graffiti, darker phrases appear taunts, insults, or quiet despair. Not all spectators cheered with admiration. Some jeered with cruelty. One reads simply, "He's a goner." The armor symbols, status, and silence. The armor of a gladiator was not just protection, it was identity. Different classes of fighters wore distinct gear, instantly recognizable to the crowd. A Retiarius wore almost no armor, just a shoulder guard and a net. A Murmillo bore a heavy, crested helmet, a large shield, and a straight sword. The helmets were especially elaborate. Some were decorated with wings, animal motifs, or grotesque faces meant to catch the torchlight and reflect it in eerie, shimmering patterns. Yet when unearthed, many helmets bear scars, deep dents, scratches, chips. Not just ceremonial, they were worn, used. Some even have names engraved within, simple, carved letters, perhaps to claim ownership, or perhaps a way of asserting selfhood in a world that reduced men to roles. Imagine holding such a helmet in your hands, knowing it once sat upon a sweating brow under the roar of a crowd, that had witnessed fear, rage, survival, burials, honoring the fallenmost gladiators, especially the enslaved, were buried without ceremony, tossed into mass graves or burned without a name. But some were honored. In Ephesus, archaeologists uncovered a gladiator graveyard, one of its kind found so far. There, bones told quiet stories of healed fractures, broken noses, and sharp cuts to the skull. Many bore signs of surgical intervention. A gladiator's light was valuable enough that schools employed doctors to patch them up and return them to training. Tombstones at these sites are humble, carved images of helmets, short inscriptions. To the memory of Marcus Antonius, fought 15 times, lived 27 years. They speak of brief, brutal lives, and a hope that someone, somewhere, would remember. Rituals, rumors, and the sacred some believed gladiators carried spiritual power. Their blood was thought to be healing, their sweat aphrodisiac. Roman women were said to collect it in vials, wearing it like perfume or mixing it with cosmetic creams. After a fight, attendants would sweep into the arena not just to clear the fallen, but to harvest what remained. In some households, gladiator blood was even consumed as a remedy for epilepsy. A strange and morbid belief, but one that speaks to how deeply embedded they were in Roman consciousness. The arena itself was rich. Before the fight, gladiators saluted the emperor with the famous line, Ave Imperator, those who are about to die salute you. Though modern historians believe this wasn't a universal phrase, it has echoed through time. Each fight began with ceremony pairings, carefully chosen, weapons matched or intentionally mismatched for dramatic effect. A trumpet would sound, a moment of silence. Then, Moshi. But before the first strike, they waited for a signal given by the editor, the sponsor of the games. Only then would the clash begin. The sacred sand, the sand of the arena, it was specially chosen, sometimes imported, to absorb blood. Often it was dyed red or mixed with crushed tiles to hide stains. After the games, this sand was sometimes collected and stored, as if the remnants of violence held meaning, as if the very ground bore witness to the weight of what had passed. These remnants, graphy bones, armor, and sand are not just curiosities. They are the closest we can come to the voices of those who had none. In these fragments, we hear what was once a whisper behind the roar of the crowd, a quiet humanity beneath the spectacle. And so we drift upward, now, from the dirt and the dust, to the marble halls of the Roman elite, to those who've watched and those who paid. Now, we ascend. From the barracks of the ludus, in the sand of the arena, we rise into a different world, one of silk-draped couches, goblets of spiced wine, and polished marble beneath bare, perfumed feet. The world of the Roman elite. And yet Van here, in the quiet luxury of atriums and gardens, the gladiator's shadow is never far. Gladiators as entertainment, obsession, and commodity. For Rome's upper class, the games were not merely sport, they were a declaration of culture, control, and spectacle. To attend a munos, a gladiatorial contest, was to participate in Roman identity itself. Senators, generals, and emperors sponsored games to curry favor, display power, and distract from politics. Tickets were free, the arena a gift to the people. Imagine reclining in the shade of the Colosseum's upper tiers, the air thick with incense and roasted chickpeas, as slaves fanned you gently. Below, two figures clashed, one perhaps barely more than a boy, the other a grizzled veteran. The fight was real, but the meaning extended far beyond. For the elite, gladiators were both thrilling and disposable. Admired, yet never respected. Used, yet never embraced. And this contradiction lived comfortably in Roman minds. Gladiator obsession among Roman women. There is no shortage of whispers in Roman literature about upper women and their fascination with gladiators. The poet Juvenal, never one to shy away from moral outrage, mocked noble women who swooned over bloodied fighters. He painted lurid portraits of patrician ladies sneaking off to the barracks, infatuated not by beauty or wit, but by scars and sweat. One satirical verse describes a woman leaving her senator husband for a gladiator, trading silk sheets for straw and the scent of perfume for iron and grit. Of course, Juvenal exaggerates. That was his style, but the fascination was real. Archaeological finds suggest wealthy women did seek out trysts or tokens from their favorite fighters. Some even paid bribes to secure private performances, arranged fights held in villas, not public arenas. And yet, a noblewoman caught in such scandal risked more than reputation. The gladiator, if caught, might be executed without question. The emperor in the games. If senators funded games to win votes, emperors used them to hold Rome itself. No one did this more lavishly than Emperor Titus, who inaugurated the Colosseum in 80 AD with 100 days of continuous games, naval battles, and countless duels. Imagine that, over 3 months of non-stop spectacle, a city pausing to watch. To the emperor, the games were not just distraction, they were a performance, a demonstration that he could feed and entertain the people. That Rome was strong, that order held, and to reinforce that order, it was not uncommon for the games to begin with public executions. Criminals, slaves, or enemies of the state were thrown into the arena before the main event, sometimes unarmed, sometimes dressed in costumes to reenact myths, dying as human stand-ins for tragic figures. These executions were not hidden. They were woven into the fabric of the spectacle, a moral warning disguised as drama. Then, the gladiators would appear, and the crowd, momentarily quieted, would roar again. The contrast of lives? It's hard to overstate the contrast between the daily life of a senator and that of a gladiator. The senator awoke on silk sheets, surrounded by mosaic floors and painted ceilings. He was served honeyed dates for breakfast, perhaps dictated letters to scribes, and received guests in shaded gardens. He might visit the baths, hold court, or debate law. Then, in the afternoon, he would attend the arena not just for entertainment, but to be seen. Seated on marble benches reserved for the elite, dressed in brilliant white or deep purple, he might raise a thumb and decide a man's fate. This wasn't done casually. It was a ritual of power, a gesture, a statement. Gladiators, in contrast, were stripped of choice. Their days were predictable, exhausting, and deeply physical. Each hour lived under supervision. Each movement trained for spectacle. Each breath offered to fate. Yet strangely, sometimes their fates crossed. Gladiators who became free and the price of fame. Some gladiators, after surviving enough battles, were granted freedom. They received a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing their release. They could then retire, often becoming trainers or bodyguards. A rare few even grew wealthy, but freedom came with burdens. A freed gladiator was never truly accepted into Roman society. They bore the scars of their past, literally and figuratively, and many found that life beyond the arena felt hollow. For some, the roar of the crowd became an addiction. Von volunteersmen who, already free, chose to re-enter the arena, either for money or for meaning, and the elite watched with fascination. Legacy in decline. By the later centuries of the Roman Empire, the games began to wane. The economy strained, barbarian threats loomed, Christianity spread, and with it, a growing distaste for blood sport. By the 5th century, Under Emperor Han, gladiatorial combat was banned altogether officially, ending a tradition that had lasted for nearly 700 years. The arenas fell silent, the barracks emptied, and the sand, once dyed red, turned pale with time. But the image of the gladiator never truly vanished. As we drift now toward the quiet of the present, let us reflect. The gladiator was not just a warrior, nor merely a performer. He was a paradox, celebrated, yet owned, powerful, yet powerless. And in the flicker of a torch, or the scrape of iron on stone, his world lives on, not in triumph, but in silence. And now, the crowd is gone. The torches have burned low. The iron gates of the arena have closed for the night. Only the quiet sound of wind through empty archways remains. We have traveled far this evening, from the dim quarters of the ludus, where gladiators rose before dawn and trained under the sun's harsh gaze, to the tale of Spiculus, whose name reached the ears of Emperor. Through the echoes of ancient graffiti and dusty armor, hidden beneath layers of ash and silence, and into the cool marble halls of Rome's elite, where bloodshed was a performance and power could decide a man's life with the lift of a thumb. We've seen how the rhythm of a gladiator's life so controlled, so unforgiving stood in stark contrast to the luxury of those who watched. And yet, both were participants in the same theater, each playing their part in a grand performance that defined a civilization. But now, those voices are quiet. The wooden swords have splintered, the red sand has turned to dust, the cheering crowds have long since faded into memory, and what remains is stillness. A helmet buried in soil, a name scratched into plaster, a pair of footprints side by side. History has a way of softening its edges over time. Even the most brutal rituals, the harshest lives, become whispers. And in those whispers, we find the humanity that connects us all, the need to be remembered, the desire to endure, the fragile hope that our struggles were not in vain. As you lie there, your breath slow, and even your body growing heavier with rest, know that you've walked through a world far removed from our own, and yet strangely familiar. The lights of Rome may be long extinguished, but the people who lived there fought, loved, laughed, and hoped. They were not so different from us. Their rhythms were different, but their hearts beat the same. And now, as the last echoes of the arena fade, you can let them go. There's nothing more you need to remember tonight. No more names, no more dates, no more battles. Just the gentle hush of time passing in sleep, waiting patiently, just beyond the torchlight, for listening.